Hello and good morning to those in Europe, Africa and the Middle East. My name is Stephen Elliott. I'm a Marketing Director here at IR, and today we've got Call Recording Assurance Risk Compliance webinar for you. We'll be going for about 40 minutes to an hour with question times at the end. Your speaker today is Travis Polland. He's our Senior Product Manager with over 20 years in contact center and UC experience. As I said, though, you'll find a section in the recording area where you can ask questions. We'll be monitoring those and we'll pose those to Travis towards the end of the webinar should you require them. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Travis to start us off today.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and thanks everyone for taking time out of their day to attend the webinar. We're going to talk about risk and compliance as it relates to assuring about call recording, and we're going to go through this. And as Stephen has mentioned, we'll gather the questions and answer them near the end of the webinar. So without further ado, let's dive right in and we're going to talk about global compliances. Global compliances are actually what is driving a number of changes and regulations are impacting contact centers and the financial traders around the globe, and these changes are happening quite rapidly. Many of them have been put in place, a few years ago, and just now coming due to be enforced in various regions around the globe, as well as many of them are being updated, enhanced technology, and things are driving that, and the regulators are driving more and more of this. In particular, when we look at some compliances, and I know we're in the EMEA region, but these are actually impacting regulatory institutions around the globe, particularly the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act, as well as the U.S. Consumer Protection Act, is actually impacting many of the banks in the U.S., but also the European and Asian banks that are actually doing business in the U.S. These are really some additional controls around the activities and the traders and the contact centers associated with these types of transactions. This is really driving a lot of call recording or the ability to keep records of these particular activities. However, with all of these changes, and there's many changes in the EU, there's many changes even down in South Africa and various different regions, but there are actually some emerging trends that really are driving compliances. Particularly, as we've started with call recording, one of the big things is we seeing a move or a trend from partial recordings within contact centers and so forth, and using these particular technologies and abilities that were truly around the managing quality management, are now requiring the use of 100% recordings to meet compliance rules and regulatory laws. This is putting an additional burden in infrastructure, from storage to networking to capturing to voice infrastructures to even additional security controls, tracking, auditing, and so forth, all surrounding that particular change in ensuring that every call is now being recorded versus just a percentage from a quality perspective. We've also seen with that an increase of retention periods for the recordings. So as we moved, the industry's moved from quality management to the compliance management, we're seeing trends of storing recordings moving from 6 months now to 1, 2, 3, 5, and 7 years to be able to retain these recordings. And these recording periods, as we move across the various lines of business, from contact centers all the way to financials, those recordings can go from being 5 or 10 minute events in a contact center to trading platforms where the call recordings can be 30 minutes, an hour, or a course of days, weeks, or months. And so the retention period in these recordings are actually increasing in the market. We're also seeing that there is a higher focus from the IT organizations around the performance management as a methodology this is really looking at root cause of problems that can cause the infrastructure these infrastructures that are now considered critical to be able to getting down to root cause to remediate, reduce, and with the ultimate goal of ensuring that no recordings are actually ever compromised and they are whole and complete. In addition, an increased amount of thoroughness in documentation and the ability necessary to report on the various compliances or out of compliances. So more of the business units are now coming in utilizing or requiring to utilizing various tools and technologies such as call recording and be able to report on those things to be able to become an anchor for regulatory compliances and various organizations and legal teams. So with all of this, it actually becomes quite expensive, and it's an increased expense that now is even falling into a requirement. However, there is a cost of non-compliance, and these particular things and these costs are really quite considerable, much more than it is around the actual financials to put these kind of infrastructures for networking, storage, and recording platforms and all that kind of stuff. It's actually quite higher than just non-compliances, which can result in substantial costs. These costs can be, they're both either direct monetary related to fines and settlements in breaches of particular compliances, into the tens of millions of pounds or hundreds of millions of pounds, or 1, 2, 3, 4 hundreds of millions of dollars in the U.S. to $1 million rand in South Africa on a per incident basis. With that, you also have indirect costs through the damages to the business's public image and reputation. Those can actually be much more than the fines and settlements. So you combine the two, they're not independent, they're actually very combined. The cost of really not complying can be extraordinarily high. This is one of the things that is driving to ensure that there is compliance in the call recording space to reduce, minimize, or not have monetary or indirect damages for non-compliance. We can see that there's a situation. Many companies have been struggling with this over the last few years. In particular, here we've had an investigation report that was just published just a few months ago. One of the things here is that the fact is the financial institutions, for example, aren't yet totally set up to accommodate for the requirements around call recording from a regulatory compliance. They're just from an architectural process perspective and properly having the infrastructure set up to handle the requirement to be able to obtain, retain, and retrieve quality records, legal records, or documents to particular trades, information, or transactions in the environment. This particular report was released from the Foreign Exchange Market investigation. You can review this online and read more of the details. In addition, we have a lot of different things that can happen, not just from an enterprise perspective or a financial institution. It can really come down to one's position inside the organization. These are two particular quotes from two different customers. As you can read, and you may be able to relate to some of these depending on your position within the contact center or a financial institution. But if we ever need the recordings we lost, we'll make the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Or our trading floors make 250,000 calls per day, and I need to record every single one. Otherwise, I'm out of the job. Many of these compliances, for example, not just have financial penalties, but they also, more than just being out of a job, they have legal criminal attachments to mishandling of these particular recordings or events, incidents. And for example, in some countries, the individual can go to prison for up to 10 years in addition to the fine that may be associated to the individual or the organization. So these regulatory compliances are becoming far more there's a lot more teeth involved in them to ensure people are adhering to those particular ones. So what are these? And so this is not a comprehensive list. This is a small fraction spread across the globe to give a kind of a sample. But you may find some of these here may relate to you guys in the organizations you're currently in today. We talked about the Dodd-Frank Act, Wall Street Act there, but you can see there's actually several of them across the EU, South Africa, all the way through, Germany and so forth, in London, and even over into Asia, Australia, and around the globe in the U.S. These particular ones, they all have similarities. Some are tougher than others, but they relate across different sectors, from financial to retail to insurance and healthcare, utilities, and what we call multiple, meaning it's really more, instead of a particular sector, it's actually across the board in either doing business or doing transactions with consumers and things like that, and handling personal information, financial information, and so forth. So as you look at these things, some of these here, and the reason you guys are probably joining the webinar is some of these may be keeping you up at night today. How are we handling this? What are we doing to address it? And so forth. So one of the key things is to look at is, what does this really look at as an actual impact? So here's some real numbers. I've pulled these out of the headlines from the U.S. and various different parts of the world. And you can see that when we look at the Security Exchange Traded recordings, that you can get up $5,000, $25,000, or $1 million per day per violation, reckless or actually purposive violation of actually doing something by intentional, where you can get $1.5 million of fines. We've had 185 million pounds fined between 2000 and 2013 and 2014 in the UK, relating to the financial exposures. You can see here that the real money attached to non-compliance, just on the fines and penalties associated, these can lead in the financial industry up to not just fines, but the removal or disqualification of your trading licenses and so forth. And so when we look at this, it is the way of doing business as well as the financial impact. So what does this really look like from a prognosis perspective? So we look at, that IR does have a solution around how do we approach this, but what I'm going to ask you guys to do is to look at the next part of this presentation as I go through it, and understand that is to ask the question as I go through it is, what are you currently doing today in your organization to assure that different areas in your organizations are adhering in the compliance, risk and compliance areas, and the security and guarantee that those recordings of those events are actually occurring? So I want you to put your hat on, and then as I go through this and I talk about the prognosis solution, I want you to keep on referring back to what are you doing today, and including what are you not doing today. So when we do look at this as an entirety here, we look at the solution. This is prognosis, the solution, and how we address the assurance of call recording. But I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. So when we look at this, we're going to look at this from the bottom up on the slide. What are you doing today in your organization to ensure that the infrastructure that supports your call recording and all the aspects that's direct and indirect are working, up and running, performing as designed, intended, and communicating today? Not just server boxes, but processes, communications between them, from voice in and out of voice, all the way down to the actual storage systems. So prognosis monitors that in real time. What are you doing today to assure that infrastructure? So if you look at this, the first layer, the basis or the fundamental is we need to have a solid foundation. Is the infrastructure really working? We go the next step up around above infrastructure assurance. most commonly impacts to recordings, and there are two sides of assuring recordings. Did I actually achieve a recording in the environment for a particular trader or contact center agent? And if so, is it really there? The other side of it is on a retention period. We talked about the long periods of retentions. How old is the retention of the oldest recording I have? And am I in violation for storage and retention period for that particular trader or contact center? Where we find in the industry the most common issues where recordings do not occur or fail, or the retention of storage of a recording fails for the length of time that is required, is around the configuration of the environments itself. And it's really the misconfiguration. As contact center agents move from one line of business to the next, or traders move from different types of inside the financial organization, or back and forth, that they get misconfigured against the policies of retention, the policies of recording, and so forth. And so what are you doing today to ensure that all of the configurations for every individual is applied to the actual compliance policies that are set out not only by your organizations, but the regulatory laws within your country and your lines of business? Prognosis looks at this as the next fundamental step of monitoring in real time misconfigurations, and that misconfigurations are on an agent or trader level as they're configured in the voice infrastructure and relates over the call recording platforms. Now, we take that as just a fundamental underlying core. Above that, we need to look at how is voice routed and how is it managed. How is the communication actually moving to and from the contact center agent and or the trader individual? We monitor the Avaya contact center and the Avaya core systems, as well as the Cisco core systems and contact centers, to ensure this area that we actually are tracking all calls coming in, all calls going out, and this is all in real time. This also allows Prognosis to know which call should have come in or gone out, and associate that to determine if is that being recorded or not recorded. And any particular, when we look at that as monitoring, right, and as a monitoring perspective, is all of the aspects of those particular infrastructures and ecosystems, are they actually operating as designed and intended? Calls coming in from the IVR all the way, from an SBC gateway all the way into the IVR, transferring through CTI layers all the way down to the particular agent's desktops. Is the media being streamed? Is it being split? Is it going, where is it going? And seeing that in real time. Understanding where faults happen at this layer allows an organization to be able to be proactive to isolate or reroute calls in the infrastructure to ensure that it is intact and actually working. Now, if we think about that, these bottom three layers, this again is the foundation or the core of the basics of what you really need to be monitoring proactively to ensure that your environment is working as is intended. We work ourselves up. We really have then two aspects of the call recording part of it. On the left side, we talk about passive real-time monitoring. So running in the background, looking at every single call that is arriving or being made outbound should have been recorded, has been recorded. Knowing that, checking that, and validating that in real time for every call that we should be monitoring for. In addition is monitor every call, the actual voice quality, all the way down to the agent or trader, as well as down to the recorder itself. Is the quality of experience, the conversation both ways, occurring of quality that could be recorded well by the recorders, to ensure that the conversation can be listened to at a later time. If you think of this from a troubleshooting perspective, the recorder is recording these particular conversations on both sides of it. The recorder could be operating as designed. It's recording what it hears. It's working like clockwork. But if the RTP stream that's actually getting down to that recorder is junk, or one side of it's junk or missing, for example, then you're only going to get either a partial side of the conversation, or you're going to get recorded junk. So it's important to actually see that for every call as it goes down to the environments. This is in a passive, running in real time in the background. And the question is, how are you obtaining that today in your organization? Also, as you would think, is we would also be, one of the things is real-time system and administrative failures, and as well as validating that the media really has content. And that's just a very broad statement and passive. But what we really are meeting there is, does it really have content? The conversation was 10 minutes, 15 minutes from a contact center perspective. Let's say the segment was a particular type of trade. It was 30 minutes or an hour long, just as an example. But the file that's actually stored on the recorder or has been transferred over to the long-term archive only is, and I'll give you worst case scenario, 10K. In both those scenarios, there's no way that file has content at 10K for that length of conversations that occurred in the system. On the other side here, when we look at active automated testing, is to be able to, we actually go through, and this is something inside the core of the product, but what are you doing today? We can make phone calls IR can make phone calls into the contact center. So are you generating calls into your contact center or into your trading platform or outbound that is on a scheduled basis? For example, many of our organizations make calls in several hours before the line of business will open up the contact center or trading floors, and they will make phone calls into the system from the outbound, transverse a particular IVR or direct in, depending on what it is. We will pick up and answer the phone. We will play an audio back. It will get recorded, and the passive real-time monitoring will pick that up to determine that it is of its quality, does it have content. This gives an organization an opportunity to be proactive before the line of business contact center actually opens up for business and does trading. That gives the IT organizations and voice engineering teams to be able to remediate the issues before being discovered, with real customers and real business being on the line, which could cause an embarrassment as well as a lot of extra stress. And those of us all have been in those situations. This, like I said, in the active automated testing, it is really two sides, because there are two sides of every contact center and trading. Inbound conversations that are coming in, as well as those are generated outside. And we do that both there. So if you think about that, from passive real-time monitoring and active automated testing, what are you doing today? How are you achieving that today in your organization to assure not only things are operational before you go live each day, but what are you doing throughout the day for every event that's occurring? Now, if we take that perspective on both those, that's actually a pretty good solid between the foundation we've talked about and really being proactive here. But we actually have a few more blocks to discuss at the very top, which is really important. So we know that we've got an audio file. We know it's been recorded and it's actually made it to the recorder. We know at least it has some sizable content. And let's just say that you guys you're doing this in your organization manually. You're manually checking these. And we've seen in organizations they do this in their organizations. They do have a percentage of their agents check less than 1% of their calls in a daily basis. We have organizations that outsource contractors to to actually look for files randomly in a day, in a week, and actually report on, and it's less than 1% of those, but at least gives them some kind of a sample. One of the things that we found is many people they retrieve it, and then they play back the audio to determine does it really have audio. The challenge we find in regulatory compliances, though, is that these people that are the people hired to do this either within their own teams or outsourced cannot really listen to recordings that maybe have PCI contents or proprietary trade information, and therefore they are limited to only the test calls that they've made and so forth, but they can also only sample, as I mentioned, 1% or less of the calls that are made or transactions made in a day or a week. So media integrity is designed as the next block across passive real-time monitoring and the active automated testing is to validate that the media that the call recording says there is a file, validating, we already said it had content, does it actually, can we retrieve it off the recorder? And can we retrieve that recording off of the long-term archive if it was actually archived? So we can check, is it retrievable? Media integrity also then says, I understand you have content. That's great. So this is where it's more than the 10K is the drastic example I've given. And from there, does it just only contain noise? Is it only one side of noise, or is it just 10 minutes or 15 minutes or an hour of silence? Maybe it's just empty of content, of actual audio content. Then from there, we need to be able to determine, is the media that's stored either on the recorder and that's actually made it over to the long-term archive, is it audible? And we do that by providing an actual score, a mean opinion score, very similar to voice, where you've got a 1 to 5 scale. 5 is absolute pristine, and 1 means I couldn't even understand what was actually said. Could I use this in a legal, be retrieved, and could the legal department use this audio file? How audible is it? The system actually rates it, and what we do is just like an individual listening to it in mean opinion scores. For those of you that are voice engineers, Prognosis actually listens to every 10 seconds, and the program actually listens to it. It analyzes against an ITU standard. It does a whole bunch of checks for that noise, lack of silence, things like that. And then throughout the length of the file, then it determines not only the average, but the low point, high point, and then gives the whole file a score, not including that it was retrievable. So if you ask yourselves, what are you doing today about that? How are you achieving that in your organization? How are you verifying what percentage of calls are you verifying and listening to, and then scoring, and then determining that your organization feels that you have enough recordings verified that could be retrieved in a legal request. Now, when we think about that, that actually creates, between all of that, a very solid solution. And even if you had people in here, that would actually create a good solid solution as well, and achieving this thing. The last two pieces are a bit of more of an umbrella per se. So with all of this monitoring and real-time connections and the business logic and things that are interconnected in here, and managing all of this kind of complexity and tracking this in real time, is Prognosis provides intelligent and actionable notifications. And when you use the word notifications in particular is because alarming isn't just good enough. Alarming we do, which is, fails, faults, and so forth. But actionable notifications is about the positive side of assuring. I have checked off all of the major critical systems. They are currently working today. All of the calls that have come in, the calls I've generated out, I can consider I have a good bill of health on today. Today is a good bill of health, and I can keep a record that I've done a series of checks. Notifications can be used for positive areas and provide various bits of information to give you and your organization a good comfort that things are operating. But they can also they can create action or actionable workbooks or actionable things that then says, I need to work on things, I need to reroute things, I need to move things from here to there, I need to look at things that are more complex or or having more of a fault issue or more of a trend. This is where that comes in. The last umbrella thing at the very top here is particularly around risk and compliance audit reporting. So we need to be able to tell somebody what happened, what was good, but also what wasn't good. So risk and compliance audit reporting is really targeted around your internal organizations from compliance auditing, the risk management team. These are a series of reports that also can be added to and expanded upon by your organization, but they provide enough information or data points to be able to identify missing recordings or failed recordings against policies and so forth that allows the organization, the risk and compliance organization and team, to be able to be proactive in notifying the regulatory compliance government or governing bodies through various paperwork and so forth, depending on what region and country and line of business that they're working in, that there could have been an issue that needs to be addressed. It's maybe by particular agent or trader, or overall general percentage of losses, and allows IT organizations to add supplemental information around current remediation actions that they're taking to support these daily or weekly or monthly reports that need to go in to the regulators. So the focus is, if you look at it, it's very comprehensive. It goes from the basis, the fundamentals of infrastructure, all the way up to the risk and compliance reporting necessary to say what is working and what is not working, what's missing and what is not missing, so that everybody has got all their checks, their I's dotted and their T is crossed. So with all of that, like, what is all of this? If we take all of this, what does it really kind of look like in a 10,000-foot level perspective? So there's a bit of a life cycle that occurs here, and we're going to go through this. And this is really simplified. And if you look at this and go, geez, I wish my IT organization was as simple. My organization was as simple as that for that many servers. We all know that, you know, this is very simple, that there could be hundreds of servers that make up the ecosystem between voice, the call recording platforms, the endpoints, and so forth. But this is more of a process or a life cycle. As we talked about briefly, you know, we looked through that stack or those Lego blocks of assurance, and you are relating that back to what you're doing in your organization to achieve these things. We can look at this from really 6 main categories. Now, there's a lot of sub-things that goes in between these things, but if we look at this at a high level, first thing is unified communications and the contact center monitoring. Are the PBXs, session border controllers, are they performing? What are they? What's the capacity? Are they achieving capacity? Are they routing correctly? What is the firmware? Are there any particulars around firmware mismatches? What faults are currently that could impact the trading or the call being delivered or executed, or even the media being correctly done? First area of looking at the life cycle. This is where the audio is really kind of being routing and some of the business logic around that. What you may find in there is CTI layers and things like that for routing decisions and who takes what and where those things go. Next thing is the media itself. Looking at every single voice endpoint, and that is the agents, the traders, and for example in EU, for example, you know, over there, the mobile banker, you know, the maker where that call's been routed out, particularly for the mobile device itself. So these are looking at every call. Is it being tracked? Is it against the individuals, the CDR, the RTCP data particularly? Are they actually getting routed to the logger? Do we have the firmwares that are going up for these particular devices? Are they configured? Are the endpoints, can we see them? Do we understand them? Is there anything wrong with them? Once the media is really being delivered there, we all know that there's a lot more going in the ecosystem. But some of this thing is, you know, what has to happen is really around validating now that the recording system understands that there is a recording. The operational database really is critical in this area, where the system has been recorded and it actually keeps track of it, is to validate, does the call recording platform really understand that there actually was a call for it? And there's a lot of call flows that make up contact centers in particular, but other parts of the organizations, that can go from very simple between two agents or an external call in to extraordinary complex call flows, and particularly where you have transferred a call or you've bridged in 2 or 3 more people, including supervisors, or even transferred that bridge. Maybe you've transferred and the other agent or person did not pick it up, but you had to pull the call back. These confuse call recording platforms often. They may hit something where a particular agent, extension supervisor, or somebody is not flagged for recording, and it actually may tell it to delete it. So validating that, does the call recording platform really think that there is a recording for this? But in that is not to really trust the database or the system to say that there is one. Next is to really validate in the life cycle of recording, it's being recorded on the logger or the recordings. That's dependent on, that's the platform, if it's NICE or Verint or so forth. But is it on the recorders themselves? Validate that it physically is there. If the database or the call recording platform says it's there, is it there? Does it physically exist? Could it be retrieved there? Does it have content? Validate it's audible at this point. In addition of monitoring these particular things, these ecosystems, is the loggers, recorders actually working? There's no faulties in the network communications? Is it getting the RTCP information? All that kind of stuff. We all know that those of you may not all know this, and I may be making that assumption there, but the next most common area of concern where recordings get lost or damaged is particularly around the archiving. So these are usually scheduled batch files. As some of you do work in this, some of you don't. These are batch files. They can run as most frequently as every 10 minutes or every 24 hours, depending on business rules and networking capacity. These get changed, compressed, and transferred over to long-term archive, as well as the record into a database warehouse for long-term retrieval information about the recording and some meta information about it. Networking, drives, capacity, all these things in the IT stuff that we all lived for decades can impact that recording may or may not make it over there, whole, complete, and audible. So the last piece is, did it actually make it all the way over there? Is it audible? Can we retrieve it? And then what's the capacity, performance, and availability of those systems? Because one of the things is being proactive to ensure, like I just mentioned, if you're running out of SAN space, then you may be, it'd be nice to know that you have a lead time of about 6 to 8 weeks to buy additional SAN capacity or migrate SAN capacity into the system. You may need 6 or 8 weeks proactively to know that is, versus finding out that you run out of capacity 2 days after it's been trying to write stuff to the drive and it's filling up and your loggers are filling up and have run out of capacity, and now you've got a real problem because no new files can be recorded, let alone archived. So in this is really the crutch at a high level. Again, this is a 10,000-foot level perspective. And if you're thinking about, from prognosis, what are the system we talked about that we monitor Avaya and Cisco and those kind of things, we're also focused around the call recording platforms of NICE. So that's, NICE, the NIM, the Engage, and NTR, Verint, and Avaya WFO as core call recording platforms in the ecosystem. But what makes this all unique is that, from our perspective, outside of you guys doing this in-house through people and process, we also have a pending international patent on matching and monitoring these things to ensure that they exist and of audible quality. If you just can't sleep at night and you need something to read to get your eyes a little drowsy, there is the actual patent number. You can look it up and read it late at night. It is pretty cool. Lots of legalese in there, but you'll get to figure it out from what we're kind of doing inside of the core of this. What this really leaves us with is about 20 minutes left in this webinar. So I'm actually going to pause, and I'm going to open it up to questions from the various folks that are on the webinar here, and answer the questions. So I'm going to turn this over and see what questions we have that's been presented.
Thanks, Travis. That's great. We do have a couple of questions coming in. One is around the service level agreements that in this area. What are they like? Can you speak to that?
It's actually a very good question. So service level agreements have a couple aspects that are growing, and we did touch on it briefly, but let me guide this a little bit. One in particular is the systems need to be 100% up and operational during business hours, and there is the real requirement from regulatory compliance is no data loss from recordings for the retention period of that is set out by the policy in the system. So, and we all know, we all understand that 100% is hard to achieve. That's why we understand 5 nines, 4 nines, 3 nines, and so forth. But the SLA is specific. They need to be able to retrieve those recordings. The environment needs to be up as close to 100% as possible to be able to record, archive, and retain quality recordings that can be auditable, those are two different words, and that's my American accent there, and ability to be retrieved at any particular point in that 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, or 7 year period for any event, any number of recordings, and there is no data loss. Great question.
Okay, and I think you covered it earlier in the presentation, but there was a question around which of the regulations cover Europe and Africa and the Middle East. I think you talked about Dodd-Frank in dealing with the US, but is there anything that the European people should look out for in particular?
Yeah, I'm going to put it right on my screen here. My mouse should be moving over right here. This one's probably big for EU. It's coming in due, I believe, January, February-ish time is when it's actually going to be enforced. It's the second version. That's probably big for the European Union. In general, PCI is also quite important. Dodd-Frank does affect or impact the EU. For South Africa, in particular, I've highlighted. It's kind of weird. I actually did highlight some of these. I may have stole this slide from somewhere else. But this is highlighted for South Africa in particular. Some of these are down here in South Africa, and South Africa over there as well, that impact the retention and fines. For example, in South Africa, this can actually impact R1 million per incident and up to 10 years in prison. And let me give you a little translation for those of you that are not in South Africa. That is equivalent to about $100,000 US per incident. 10 years in prison is 10 years in prison, regardless if you're in South Africa or the US. But you can see that's per incident per recording. And so that you can see that even those relates to those of you up in Europe. 10 million pounds or more can be fined in some of these organizations, depending on the volume of impact or breach that may occur for loss of recordings. The big one for EU is this one right here on the screen. Good question.
Okay. Well, great. Thanks, Travis, and thanks to everybody in the audience who came on to view the webinar. We'll be holding other webinars in the future, and you can check our channel on Bright Talk as well. Thanks, everybody, for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at a webinar sometime in the future. Thanks again, and have a great day wherever you are.